Bueno, es Caricasco Gorka. Muchas gracias a todos. I'm going to give the presentation in English, and as Gorka has done before, I'd also like to say sorry for Elena Bárcena, who was supposed to be doing this presentation, but for different reasons hasn't been able to come here today. So what I'd like to talk to you, I'm coming from UNED, but really representing the Atlas Research Group, and it's a research group we started about 10 years ago, and we've been working on an intelligent adaptive systems for language learning, mobile learning, MOOCs since then. And so a lot of the work I'm talking about has been sort of carried out by members in the group. And last year we started up a special interest group, a SIG, in Eurocall on mobile learning, because there really does seem to be a lot of people interested in it, and we're beginning to get some interesting collaborations going there. So if you're interested in joining, then please do. So today I want to talk about modularity and mobility for second language learning. I'm going to touch upon MOOCs and talk about some of that stuff and mobile learning, but I'm not going to talk too much about either, because I believe you're going to have speakers who will actually talk about these sorts of things in more detail. And then we've had a couple of language MOOCs at UNED. I'm going to talk about them briefly, and also, if you like, what could be a hypothetical scenario which could actually try to make use of some of the affordances that mobile learning can actually bring to language learning and MOOCs. Okay, so if we start to talk about modularity, I think what we almost take for granted is how easy it is for us all to actually get online and connect to the internet these days. It's something which we've seen possibly over the last decade or so. And I think one of the things we say about the differences between the Web 2.0 and the 1.0 is that we don't really talk about killer apps anymore. I mean, we just take the technology for granted. It's us, it's the people who are the added value to the web these days. It's what we actually bring there, which actually makes it of interest. And the thing is that when you actually start to look for information on the big search engines like Bing or Google, in Google, for example, there's over 1 trillion pages that's actually indexed there. So it's actually really hard sometimes to find what you really want, because if you start to make searches, you can find tens or hundreds of thousands of pages. So I think sometimes we suffer, if you like, from a bit of information overload. So specifically, one of the questions I like to ask myself once in a while is that if we're all so motivated to learn languages, and there are so many pages for what I call 2LL second language learning resources actually online, and there are many, many different pages, and there is quite a lot of high quality content, why is it we don't speak other languages better than we actually do? And I wouldn't claim for a second to have the whole answer to that, because there's a lot of psychopedagogic and psycholinguistic problems actually related to it. But I think in part, at least the part which corresponds to what we try to do as educators, is the information overload. And I think there is where the subject which I have to talk about today, the question of modularity and granularity and structure, can actually help us to bring chaos to, that's a Freudian slip there, can actually help us to bring order to the chaos and what we're actually trying to do. And one of the speakers earlier, when she was presenting the conference, was actually talking about the motivation, why should the students still come to class? And I think we still have something to offer them, and I think that's that role the language teachers will carry on to have in the future. And it's not just the content that needs to be modular. It's also, in our experience, actually the activities and the communication and the learning which needs to be actually structured in a coherent way. Because what we actually want to do with these courses is actually provide some kind of scaffolding. That is, some kind of temporary structures which will help the students get going to work on their communicative competencies, and as they begin to get along, then we gradually take these away from them, and because they're able to actually move along on their own. Okay, let's talk about the other part briefly, the importance of mobility for second language learning. There's lots of really good presentations online, lots of very good reports by top European international organizations about mobile devices and what's happening in the world, and the data, it just freaks me out when I actually see it. One of my favorite presentations here was done by a guy called Benedict Evans, which was released in 2013. You might have seen it. 2 weeks after it was actually put online, it went viral. It got up to 350,000 views, and it's gone over 400 and something thousand views, and the data is just incredible. And I think it's what Gorka was talking about before, that in 2013, and also the first quarter of 2014, as you can see here, the big hardware manufacturers have sold somewhere in the region of 1,250 million devices, in comparison to just 250 million desktop devices. It's now extremely common to find people who are not particularly interested in computers or computing to be accessing the internet and the web using their mobile devices. Because I'd argue that they're intrinsically more made for communication than our computers. With our computers, we have to take some steps to actually get them to do that. But with our mobile devices, if you like, they're already waiting for us. They're just a couple of clicks and we've shared a photo or sent a message to friends and colleagues. And the latest data shows that something like 70% of the accesses to Facebook are from mobile devices. And on the mobile social media, roughly about 400,000 photos are shared a day, and on the big messaging systems, something like 15 billion messages. So if you like, the people are already there, the students are already there. It's not that us as educators are trying to encourage people to use these means for their education. It's actually the other way around. But if only it were that simple. So Ben says, okay, life is mobile, but I'd like to actually question, I don't think it's really mobile, not yet and not really, because we don't have this almost ubiquitous access to information. In some countries, in some cities, I think Bilbao is pretty good for their open Wi-Fi spots, but certainly where I live, close to Madrid, we don't really have any open access. So what we're typically doing, a lot of us, as we move around now, if you look at the use cycles of the people, we're going through a series of devices. We're starting with our home PCs, maybe in the morning, using our smartphones on public transport. We then get to the office where we work on the main computer, and then maybe the smartphone again at home. And then later on, when we're crashed in front of the television or in bed, we're using our tablet. So what we're trying to look for here, if you like, is a continuity of educational experience across these different devices. And there is a line of research which is actually looking at this particular area, mobile seamless learning, and there are people actually trying to attack this from a particular technological point of view, but I also think in an educational context it's something we need to be thinking about. And also what I like to say to students is that we have to be careful of the old hammers and nails adage, because if the only tool we have is a hammer, we tend to treat all the objects around us as if they are nails, and not every device is appropriate for every single activity. For example, being a bit of a techno geek, I remember when I got my first mobile phone which had a connection to internet, I actually read an entire book on there. And I certainly wouldn't do that again. It was incredibly masochistic and not a very satisfying experience. And also when it comes to entering data, mobile devices and these touch screens, at least with my big thumbs, aren't as comfortable as they could be. So maybe we want to find the right tool for the right job. Maybe my computer's having a siesta. It's thinking about it, it's flashing, but it's not changing screen. No. Oh, yeah, I've gone past 2 now, it's okay. It was just waiting for you to get out the seat, Gorka, before it, now it's waiting to go backwards. Maybe I should stop pressing buttons, actually, that might help. You want to get up again, Gorka, see if it inspires the computer to change. Okay, was that the next slide?
Next slide.
Have I missed a slide? 1 second. The images aren't that big.
It's very old, you know.
So am I. Okay, I won't go back any further, I won't risk it. So before we go on to talk about language learning and the interest in using massive online courses and mobile devices, I think we just have to take a second to look at the educational context in which we're actually moving. There's been a lot said about this, but I think the seminal publication was the UNESCO report, which said that by around about 2025, there's going to be somewhere in the region of 100 million potential students. This is people looking for higher education. And I call them potential students because, unfortunately, the majority won't have the economic resources to be able to pay for the time they need to spend in universities to actually get the qualifications they want. So we need another kind of solution. And also something we're actually seeing in our own universities is that the natality rates are dropping in the first world, and the students that we do have don't actually want to come to class anyway. So what we're having to do is to try and find ways of compensating these questions, and as presumably the people who are going to be talking about MOOCs will say, that certainly appears to be an interesting way forward. But the difference we've seen over the past decade is that we don't no longer hoard information, we share information. So therefore knowledge, we can say, it's shared, it's aggregated, filtered, and fed forward, which is something which is actually very useful for the educational process and is actually very, very important for language learning. because actually the vehicle we're using, language, is what we're actually trying to learn, if you like. And it's not just the knowledge, it's the skills which go along with it at the same time, which we actually want to be able to apply to our process. So therefore, if you take a step forward from that, we can assume, therefore, that language is becoming more open, more social, collaborative, personalized, and also networked. I think that's what we're seeing reflected in the practices which are taking place at the same time. I also wouldn't claim for a second that we actually know where this is going, because if you actually search for some basic terms on Google, for example, the future of language learning, there's actually, or at least yesterday when I did this, it was somewhere in the region of 86 million pages. And if you just randomly click around, there's lots of people who are more than happy to give you their opinion on this. And you can also argue from a technological perspective with, if you look at technology like the Google Translation, which will translate audio, Google Now, and the wearable computer, that maybe in the future the actual need to learn languages will become less important. But certainly not something I want to talk about myself. Okay, so when we actually think about using massive online courses for learning, I like to say that there's, if you like, a certain degree of intrinsic suitability of the material for the actual platform, in the sense that some things can be taught and learned better than others. And that language, if you like, is something we found from experience after having run a couple of MOOCs now, is something which lends itself rather nicely to the medium. I mean, when the Council of Europe specified their common European framework and they started to talk about the different skills, if you like, and the cognition, metacognition you'd need to be able to learn languages, and they started to specify the different types of linguistic competencies, then you can actually see that what you really have is a set of skills which you can learn in different MOOCs, if you like, provided they're actually managed in a way which actually enables you to do that. So then, if you like, when we look at the different kinds of MOOCs, and I don't particularly want to talk about this in any detail, if you like, just basically saying that you've got, if you like, your X-MOOCs, which are like your traditional online courses which have been moved into an open platform, and you have the C-MOOCs, which are more networked and open. I mean, both of these courses have something to offer. The advantages of the X-MOOCs are the structure, and students do need structure when they are learning languages. But on the other hand, sometimes it can actually limit the flexibility in the interaction they actually need to carry out to actually work on these language competencies. But the greatest strength, if you like, and also the challenge for the people that are running the courses are the student numbers. This is something we can use in our favor to actually promote interaction and communication, which is, if we can actually get them to do this in the target language, which isn't always the case, can in itself be very constructive. What practice shows with a large community is there's a small percentage of students who will automatically use the target language. There's a small percentage of students that actually flatly refuse to use the target language, and then you've got a block in the middle who actually gain quite a lot of it, and sometimes they will and sometimes they won't. And the interesting thing here is that in standard face-to-face classes, even though the students have access to high-quality teachers in the sense that they're experts in their domain of language teaching, they really don't quite often have the opportunity to interact and communicate as much as they would wish to. And this also happens even on online courses. We talked about 10 years ago, I was there with Gorka, and we were also talking about the advantages of online courses, and the problems that were associated with those courses precisely was the fact they were closed. So not all the people who could actually be beneficial members of the community were actually taking part in the courses. So what we found is that correctly structured and managed MOOCs will, in fact, be a useful vehicle for language learning. Still a lot of problems to solve, and that's actually, like, given rise to the language MOOCs. So what we've seen is that these courses are actually popular with the students, also popular with the staff as well, because in essence, they actually attend the intrinsic need of the people to communicate, to interact, and to build the skills they need if we provide them with the right scaffolding. I'll talk about this a little later. But also in the literature, there's a lot of criticism of these types of courses. For example, there's many criticisms. Some of them, for example, they don't actually have contact with native speakers, which is actually important for developing language competence. There's a certain lack of proactiveness. It's very easy to become passive, to become somebody who's watching on, not actually getting involved. And the interactions are typically superficial. The learning that goes on tends to go in the same way. People typically don't help each other. in these courses, they're looking out for number one, and so they need to actually be trained, if you like, or at least heavily motivated before this takes place, and that this is actually a big challenge for the teaching team, even if they are actually motivated, because quite often they're not actually present once the course is kicked off and is actually running. Even if they are, it's hard to give feedback because there's a very large number of students, and also the role they have in that society is changed, and they can sometimes feel threatened with what they actually have to do. Now, answers. I put a question mark here because this is very much work in process. This is research we're doing, and we don't have all the answers. Some of them we might do, but it's things which need to be tested and tried again. Firstly was regarding the access to a native speaker. It's not necessarily the case that having this access will actually enable someone to learn better than they would in other ways. The classic example I like to give, without putting any names on the table, is that a colleague of mine, when the socialist government was running the country a few years ago, a friend of mine, an English native, was actually hired to give classes to one of the members of the government. And once a week they'd sit down, drink coffee for a couple of hours, and she would correct his English, and he practiced very hard, but 2 years went down the road, and the person didn't really get any better at actually speaking in English, because they lacked actually the other parts of the equation, the other parts of the training that was actually necessary. So, okay, sometimes it can be beneficial to have this presence, but it's not necessarily what's needed to learn the language. What we've seen, what we've tried to put in our courses, if you like, is the need to work in the target language, using, if you like, the same metacognitive and cognitive strategies that you would actually when you're in authentic real learning scenarios. And what's actually important here is the activities you're actually doing, and the granularity of them, of the modularity of the content and the activities. You actually need a sense of continuity so that the students actually feel part of what they're actually doing, and one thing leads on to the next, as I'll talk about in a while. So what we've done in the course is we've actually run, if you like, is put together what's like an iterative scaffolded language scenario. So if you like, this is a spiral approach. So we start off with students in a particular context, giving them a minimalist, instructivist amount of theory, just enough, a bootstrapping process, if you like, to get them going, and then put them into the communication-based scenario. Use social constructivism, using the spiral approach, and then once we've actually got them doing these activities and they've learned what they needed to learn in this context, then if you like, we can go one spiral more and start to introduce new activities, while at the same time taking a couple of steps backwards, so they're constantly working back over what they've actually done. Okay. I talked about scaffolding. We need scaffolding mechanisms. What do we actually mean by scaffolding mechanisms? Well, once again, this is a subject of research, but in essence what we need to do here is to prevent the internalization of erroneous language, while at the same time not taking away the flexibility and adaptability, leaving them motivated to carry on communicating. Because if you correct somebody so much they're frightened to open their mouth, then they're really not going to learn a great deal. Some of the strategies we've tried in the MOOCs that have worked quite well, obviously I've talked before about the difficulty of giving feedback to people, but one thing you can do, and what does seem to work, is that with any particular community, there's always a few people one step ahead of the rest, if you like. They're the keenies, the other people that are really actually committed. And what we've actually tried in this instance is actually selecting them, if you like, and giving them a VIP feedback. We make sure they understand what's going on, and then we encourage them to propagate this back to the rest of the group. And then you suddenly find you get sort of layers of propagation occurring, and that way the feedback seems to be a little bit more even. Also, it's very necessary. The forums in MOOCs are very massive and they're difficult to manage, so it's actually very important to have software which will automatically form small groups and let the students work on group activities. Once you've got collaborative small group activities, then you can actually then say, okay, once the group's happy with what they're producing, then they should then review what, for example, 2 other groups are doing and reach an overall consensus. And then once you've actually allowed them to explore that, then you can put some kind of test conditions at the end, so they can actually really check to make sure that between them they've actually reached the understanding they need. Okay, so let's talk about the mobile aspects. So we've coined the term MALMOOCs, which are mobile assisted books. I mean, I've motivated, if you like, in a way, why we want to do that. And actually, it's quite interesting that when I was running the UNED MOOC platform, at the time, the platform wasn't 100% compatible with mobile devices, and we used to get a lot of requests from people for this actually to be the case, to make the mobile technology work, and I think I motivated that before. It's actually interesting to see these days how this mobile technology and the mobile infrastructure is part of everyday life. And I think it was Kaplan in 2012 talked about this in terms of mobile social media and differentiated between the different kinds of services that are actually around. I'm not going to kind of read step for step what's actually put on the slide here, but it's clear that we're already there. The students are already there, and they're wanting to use this technology to work with their online courses. So therefore, the question is, how can we actually use this technology to complement what we're actually doing in these online courses? As I said before, MSL, Mobile Seamless Learning, is a discipline which is actually studying this, if you like, change from one mobile device to the other. And Wong and Luo in 2011 actually highlighted 10 dimensions which were actually if you like, common across the many different theories. The problem with mobile learning is that there's just a massive body of literature, and there's almost a different theory of how it happens for every day of the year. And maybe I'm exaggerating a bit, but there's certainly a large amount of literature out there. So we really need to try and look for underlying characteristics which we can apply in a more general way than sticking with a particular theory or not. And I think these 10 characteristics, these 10 dimensions, if you like, are something that we can actually think about, and they will motivate a lot of research which is going along in the future. And for example, the idea of the relation between formal and informal learning, I think little by little we're moving towards a state where we will tend to not differentiate quite so clearly between when we're actually learning and when we're actually living. We'll have this state of digital living, for example. So the idea there being that if you're actually carrying on your day-to-day activity and you've got small amounts of time, then you'll possibly make the use of that, or to bring the contents from your life into the course, or to knit back to the course just to see if you've had a reply from a message you've put, or some activity's been marked, or something like that. The idea is both personalized and social, I think should be quite clear. And the idea that it's so distributed across time and space, regardless of the actual device we're using. Well, I'm not going to go through the rest of the characteristics here, but people are now beginning to think of mobile devices and MSL as a way of complementing, if you like, some of the difficulties we have on these online courses. So what we've done, if you like, is just to take this one step further and try and say, okay, how can our mobile devices help us in these sorts of massive online courses? And I think we've differentiated really 3 different ways we can do that. I mean, the first one, an obvious one, is as a portable course client. It's something which can actually enable us to access the course. And the term they use in the literature is anytime, anywhere access, for obvious reasons. I'm waiting for the bus, I can access. I'm waiting to pick up a child from a class, I can access again. But the flip side of the coin is also equally interesting and important, the idea of sometime, somewhere activities. At the moment, if the people who actually put together these courses are thinking about mobile clients and people working with these devices, which is almost never the case, they're just assuming they'll connect in the same way as other students. But depending on the kinds of activities you're thinking of for the students, you can actually anticipate that they will be in certain environments, certain contexts, and actually use that as a trigger to connect, to carry out a specific kind of activity. So that's a whole degree of freedom which is not being explored at the moment. But what we all appreciate, obviously, is this is giving us a more frequent access to the platform, more opportunities for interaction, communication, and collaboration. On the second front, the idea of our mobile devices being a sensor-enabled device. I mean, I think we can think of our mobile phones today, or digital devices, as being some kind of like the digital equivalent of the Swiss Army knife. We've got a whole pack of sensors on these devices, which gives us a way of tuning into the world in a very interesting way. Even quite simple interactions. For example, if we've got the activity of, for example, finding examples of vehicles in the context around us, then a certain make of red car, for example, and then that can be gamified, then it's very easy for us to see the car we want. We take a photo, we tag it in the target language, and we shoot it up to the course. That's something which is very easy to do, and there's a lot more sophistication. that's going to be coming on in the near future. There's a lot of blurb going around at the moment about the Apple iWatch, which is about to be announced. And some of the theories about that is it's going to have somewhere in the region of up to 20 different sensors. I don't know if that's true or not, but we can kind of see where that's going to in the future, and the possibility of wearable computer devices and what that will actually mean for us. Then we can actually think about these devices in terms of small handheld computers, because thanks to the technological advancement, I'm not sure if Moore's law still applies to these devices as they do to our desktop computers, but they are now computationally sophisticated to be able to carry out almost real programs, to execute real programs and actually do things which are really quite sophisticated. And we've got here really an extensible architecture of different apps which can provide us, if you like, tools we can group into two kinds, into general purpose tools which we can use with relation to our courses, and specific second language tools. Now, obviously there's a problem here. There's a problem that's beginning to be looked at in the literature, and that is that if you look at the two main App Store, Google Play and the Apple Store, there's hundreds of apps for learning language. But so far, we haven't got the killer app. Sometimes some of them are slightly more fashionable than the other. I think Duolingo, when it came out, received a lot of hype because the guy who did it had done something else which was very popular beforehand, but they don't really seem to have taken off. And also, for the people who are actually teaching languages, I don't notice any of my colleagues are frothing in the mouth about how wonderful any of these apps are going to be used in the future. Where I think they will be important is that they will begin to blur the difference between when we're learning and when we're living. And that will be something which is important for us in the future. So, an example, let me give you an example of something which we've tried parts of, but we haven't really taken it all the way through with large numbers of students because we don't actually have a platform that will let us do that at the moment. We hope to do it shortly. It's based upon the professional English language MOOC we had at UNED, which had 33 and a bit thousand students, around about B1 level, and it was something which followed a year in the professional life of an English guy that went to work in the States, I think it was. And right from the time he was looking for jobs, he got the job, he started working in the company, etc. And there was video and audio, massive amounts of content. So linguists on the project worked extremely hard, and when the course is back online, I'd encourage you to have a play with it. There's one particular module which was on the sub-language of jobs. And without actually running through the whole module, because I don't really have a lot of time, the idea was that at the beginning they start to explore how job adverts are typically structured, how different kinds of jobs are put forward in different ways, and then once they've studied that, they've seen some videos, explanations, etc., they'd undertake some individually closed activities on the basic concepts, just to make sure they've got the fundamental concepts clear. They then move on to work collaboratively in small groups to prepare particular job ads on particular areas within the scenario. They then criticize and contrast each other's work, and then they'd finally have some kind of closed test just to make sure that the sub-language in question and the intercultural competencies are clear. So one of the scenarios would lend itself really well to this kind of Malmuk approach, and it's the idea of searching for, if you like, the role of intercultural differences in job ads. So, for example, the scenario we would give them is what's shown on the screen here, that in job advertisements in some countries, it's common to find references to what one might consider to be personal traits, requirements of candidates to be of a specific sex, certain age range, has physical characteristics, given religion, etc. And this is true, even though there's a lot of politically correct control on the web, this still is the case. We then give this some open-ended reflexive questions. What do you think about this? Do you think this is discriminatory? Can you understand it in particular context? And then the idea is to structure a series of activities, some of which are easier, if you like, or better to do on the desktop environment, other on mobile devices. So once they've gone through the reflective questions, the idea that they could start to explore the job ad websites and mooch around on the mobile social media. And here, once again, this is something you could do equally well on either the two environments, desktop or mobile, depending on your life circumstances. You could then take the next step to use some particular job hunting services like LinkUp or Monster, which are the two big portals for employment in the world, and they've also got they've got their relative apps, and then begin also to draw it through into the real life of the people, the idea to explore the particular jobs and skills you find in your daily life. So if you actually happen to come across job ads stuck on the supermarket notice board or put in the window of a shop, obviously it's going to depend where you're doing the course. It'll be in a different language, but you can at least take a photo, translate it and put it online, or you can see people working and begin to ask yourself questions. Why is it, for example, that the cleaners in my particular department are all women? And once you've begun to formulate these questions, then you can put it up online in the course and begin to interact around this. And this whole process can be gamified. You can do it for the person who finds the most examples, for the person who finds the most outrageous example, etc. And then they can actually enter into a different set of activities related to that. Small group collaboration to explore the answers to these questions, compare and contrast, and then move towards, if you like, particular assignments that can be, if you like, a summary of answers to these questions, or looking at particular fragments of the most outrageous language, and then we move into a final test just to make sure that with the criteria used by the teachers, that the intercultural competencies, the basic vocabulary and language is pretty much under their control. So hopefully I'm sticking to my time here. So conclusions and future work. MAMOOCs, in our opinion, depend, if you like, on a delicate balance between modularity and mobility. Because if you don't structure the content, if you don't give the students the initial scaffolding, they get lost. I mean, the classic criticism made by students in CMOOCs, for example, is they're lost in cyberspace. There's just so much information, so many interactions, that it's difficult to follow. Even Stephen Downes, who's one of the super gurus on this question, when you actually ask him about the way his students study on their courses, he'll say, oh, well, it's not intended for them to study the whole course. They just find a bit they like and they stay there. Now, that could be okay, it all depends what your objectives are, but if you're trying to structure a language learning exercise, then possibly that may not be the best way to do this. And just to highlight a couple of points, I think that mobility will extend learning into everyday life activity and begin to blur the boundaries. And the irony here is that we're going the full circle. I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, we were criticizing small face-to-face classrooms for many reasons, looking to the online world to give us the solution, and here we are more than 10 years later, and we've gone full circle back into our everyday life. What's got better is the technology and the context that we're actually working in, but the technology won't give us the actual answers. It has to be, if you like, it has to be a social constructivist solution, actually getting people to communicate in the way they would in the real authentic scenarios, or otherwise we're going to find that they're not actually going to learn as they intend to learn. Our particular group, just with some information to leave you, we're going for European funding to carry on working in this area. And we've published a fair bit on this particular area, so if you're particularly interested in reading about this, I've got some publications up here. If you only want to read a couple of them, then I'd highly recommend my own work, obviously. So, for example, the Architectonics of Language MOOCs, which has just come out, or Toward Mobile-Assisted Language MOOCs. If you search for this on Google Scholar, you can find it. We've got a bit of self-publicity, Gorka won't mind, I'm sure. We're teaching 3 summer schools on the application of this technology to the language class, and you're more than welcome to join us. They are in Madrid, Ponferrada, and Denia, but you don't have to physically go. The courses can be done online. All the content will be streamed. And finally, we've got a CFP out at the moment for the Journal of Universal Computing Science on mobile technology. So if you're actually researching this, then we'd encourage you to publish or to submit articles to this journal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim, for your brilliant presentation. La presentación, como decía, de Elena Bárcena y Tim Read, la modularización digital del conocimiento, el caso del aprendizaje de segundas lenguas, tan brillantemente expuesta por el profesor Read de la UNED.